Welcome to the City of Dinuba Wellfield Remedial Investigation Feasibility Study Quarterly Technical Advisory Committee meeting. Just so you guys all know, just a little bit of housekeeping. This meeting is being recorded, and then we can also share that recording with those TAC members who are not able to attend today. If you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to ask them either by unmuting yourself and interrupting, or by typing in your question into the chat box. And then with that, if we could just do some brief introductions since we have some new faces in the meeting today. I'll start off. I'm Trilby Barton with Provo and Pritchard, and I am in charge of the public outreach for this project.
I guess I'll go next. I'm Sarah Raker, and I'm with Formation, and I am the project manager for this project.
Mike Tietze with Formation, the project director.
Ishmael Hernandez, Public Works Director for the City of Dinuba.
We'll hit the Provo and Pritchard folks, and I'm Steve Spencer with Provo and Pritchard, and we're assisting Formation with the feasibility study portion of the project.
I'm Kelly McInerney, and I'm also with Provost and Pritchard.
Hi, I'm Nick Anker. I'm with Formation, and I'm working on the flow contaminant transport modeling portion of the project.
Hey, Pete Townsend with Formation Environmental, also helping with the fate and transport modeling.
Robin, you want to kick off for the...
Sure. So I'm Robin Gio. I am the project manager on the Division of Financial Assistance, the State Water Resources Control Board side. So I am facilitating the grant for this project.
And I'll jump in right behind Robin. This is Trisha Carter, also with DFA. I'm another project manager within our groundwater grant program unit, and here to field any other questions that you may have with your existing project or round 3 potential application.
This is Paul Dotson with the Regional Water Quality Control Board in Fresno. I'm an engineering geologist in our site cleanup unit and have a lot of TCP and nitrate sites, so I was asked to provide any technical assistance that we can.
Hi, Kristen Willett here with the Division of Drinking Water. I'm the assigned engineer to the City of Dinuba.
Great. Thank you, everybody. And I think we've got everybody introduced. So with that, I will turn it over to Sarah Raker to get us started with the presentation.
Thank you, Trilby, and thank you, Trilby, again for setting up this meeting. Really appreciate it. So good morning, everyone. This will be our quarterly meeting to update you on the current progress of the project. If you want to go to the next slide. This project is being funded through Prop 1, and it's required that we provide this funding disclosure. Let me just read it real quickly. The project has been provided in full or in part by Prop 1, the Water Quality, Supply, and Infrastructure Improvement Act of 2014, through an agreement with the State Water Resources Control Board. The contents of this presentation do not necessarily reflect the views and policies of the foregoing, nor does mention of trade names and commercial products constitute endorsement or recommendations for use. Next. So our agenda today is to give you an update on the remedial investigation report, which we've been working on this project, the summary of the data collection and analysis that we talked about it during our last meeting, and now we'll give you more details on that. And then really the key focus of the meeting is the hydrogeologic conceptual model, the distinction of the groundwater zone designations, the contaminant sources and transport, our solute transport modeling update, and then we'll let you know where we are in the schedule with upcoming milestones. And then finally, we'll have it open for questions and comments. But again, you're welcome to ask questions throughout the presentation. Okay, so this is one of my favorite little slides that Mike put together. It's really summarizing the gist of the project. The red circles donate the focus of today's presentation. In the past two or three meetings, we talked about the data compilation and how we were collecting the data. Now we'll present to you the remedial investigation, the development of the groundwater model, and then we will have a brief analysis of the engineering evaluation. But ultimately, everything all focuses on the feasibility study and ultimately the preferred implementation project. So, next slide. So the objective of the RI is to provide the data and background necessary to perform the comparative analysis of potential implementation project alternatives that will be presented in the FS. And just to step back a little further, the overall objective of the Dinuba Wellfield project is to identify, evaluate, and prioritize an implementation project that optimizes wellfield activity to prevent the spread of nitrate, DBCP, and 1,2,3-TCP contamination in the drinking water aquifer that underlies the city. The city is also interested in combining wellfield operational strategies with additional recharge basins and load reduction strategies in the future to help improve both groundwater quality and quantity. So the groundwater flow model is complete, and we are in the project alternative analysis phase and the solute transport modeling phase. And again, the alternatives will be presented in the FS. For the remedial investigation, if you go to the next slide, I'm going to give you just an outline of what the report will contain, including the introduction and background, summary of the RI data collection and analysis, and I'll be discussing those elements today. And then the hydrogeologic conceptual model, the nature and extent of contamination, identification of data gaps. Mike will be talking about that. Next slide. So the setting for the project is in Fresno and Tulare counties in the Alta Irrigation District and in the Kings River East Groundwater Sustainability Agency. Those borders are indicated there in the color. So you can see in the figure the Kings Groundwater Subbasin, the Dinuba Subregional Model Boundary that we presented during our last meeting, which is the blue boundary. And thank you, Trilby. The inner green boundary is the Dinuba Refined Model Boundary. We'll be talking a lot about that. And then the pink boundary shows the extent that we focused on to evaluate the distribution of nitrate, DBCP, and TCP. So in terms of just getting yourself oriented, the larger blue is the larger model that we discussed last time, from which we extracted, you can see the green Dinuba Refined Model with the city in the center. The pink box around the edge was helping us look at what was outside the model boundary in order to better inform what we were ultimately going to be modeling inside the green boundary. So let's just step through some of the setting and background material. The next slide shows you land use surrounding the city. We have the urban and city boundary in gray and salmon. The city boundary itself is the purple line. We're going to keep using those colors throughout the figure. This also shows you the parks and stormwater retention basins in the green. And then you can see the wastewater reclamation facility and the surrounding agricultural land. Next slide. This slide shows us the surface water features in the area that are important to this project. The creeks, canals, ditches, and pipelines are all shown in blue. The stormwater retention basins are in turquoise. The Dinuba Reclamation, Conservation, Recreation, RCR Pond, which is over on the west, is used for temporary storage of shallow groundwater pumped from our RCR well number 1 and is used to fertilize the golf course. And then the other surface water feature is the wastewater reclamation facility, evaporation, percolation ponds. And those features will be discussed throughout with reference to evaluating the proposed alternatives. Next slide. So this shows you the city wells and test wells. This is primary information for the RI. The test wells are shown in red, and those are boreholes that were used to design the city's supply wells. After the data was collected, those boreholes were destroyed. Then there's the active city wells that are shown in kind of bright green. It's kind of hard to see them here. They look a lot like the basins. And active irrigation wells are in yellow. And then there's destroyed or inactive wells that we're showing in gray. This slide shows you the known contamination sites in the city. I've also included one in the city of Reedley, the Western Farm Services, because that was important for us to understand when we were looking at the distribution of nitrate through, outside the model area. It is a fertilizer and pesticide facility. But in general, these releases are limited to more discrete plumes. One impacted City Well 1, which was destroyed in 2015, and City Well 5, which was destroyed in 2019, but have not impacted the city's current drinking water supply wells. Next. So in the previous investigations, which is an important part of the RI summary, these are essentially the key documents that helped inform the conceptual site model, including the hydrogeology and contaminant occurrences, sources, and transport in the Dinuba Wellfield project area. Also, the development of the aquifer zone designations, source loading and transport characteristics for the refined model, and the solute transport model. Next slide. So just as a refresher from the previous meetings, we'll talk about the summary of data collection and analysis. And in this slide, I'm showing you once again the blue and the green and the pink boundaries, but now I'm plotted all the wells on that we've used to evaluate this data. So to meet the objectives of the project, we collected data in the following areas: the Dinuba sub-regional model, which is the blue larger boundary, the Dinuba refined model, the green boundary on the inner side by the city, and then what I'm calling the groundwater contaminant boundary. It's again the big pink box that helped us inform what was going on inside. Next slide. So the data sources are numerous, and I'm just constantly amazed at how fantastic the data have and robust the data sets are on these publicly available sites. So we downloaded, compiled, put them into a database, and we talked a lot about that during our last meeting. But the importance is that I consider the most important data to be the water quality data and the well construction data. Those were absolutely critical to evaluating the nature and extent of the contaminants. And in addition to the publicly available data sources, the City of Dinuba records and documents were essential to understanding the historical and current groundwater conditions in the Dinuba Wellfield project area. Next slide. So here's a summary of what we did with all that data. And this is another important summary that will be described in the RI. Starting off with, what did we sample? We sampled 26 locations, wells and boreholes, for the remedial investigation, specifically for nitrate, DBCP, and TCP in groundwater, including profile samples, collecting groundwater samples at discrete depths, and also evaluating the hydraulics within the wells that we were profiling. Extraction data was collected from 36 separate well locations. That was important for the development of the groundwater flow model. Specific capacity data was used to evaluate hydraulic conductivity for the flow model. And then 387 wells with lithologic logs were used to evaluate the textural analysis of the aquifer and determine hydraulic parameters of the flow model. Then inside the Dinuba refined model boundary, we used 140 wells that had water quality data and well construction data, and those were used to essentially create contours within the Dinuba refined model boundary. But as I mentioned before, outside the Dinuba refined model boundary, we had the contaminant analysis boundary, and that was 520 wells. And Mike will talk about the specifics on how we parsed data with well construction screen intervals and total depth intervals, and what assumptions that we used. Next slide. So here are all the wells that we used within the contaminant analysis boundary, and you can see that we have wells used for contaminant contours in blue. We have wells used for aquifer textural and specific capacity analysis in red, and then additional wells that were used for the aquifer textural analysis in green. So this is a map showing the small water systems that are in the inside and outside the DRM. I just want to say thank you, Kristen, again, for your help on providing well completion reports and more details about these water systems that are in your jurisdiction. Also, just to point out those locations outside the city, and there's community, non-transient, non-community type small water systems. Next slide. This slide shows the distribution of domestic wells. Again, a separate source of information. In general, we're lacking information on well construction for these wells. So we assume that these wells are constructed in the shallow groundwater zone, and Mike will elaborate on that. Next slide. Just to get us back to the location of the specific wells that we sampled, we show both the wells that we had video surveys that were part of our profiling, and the location of the remedial investigation samples. And then also in a light pink box that's kind of hard to see, the specific wells where we conducted the dynamic and ambient profile testing. Okay, next slide. I'm going to hand it over to Mike, and he'll talk about the last three sections of the RI report, essentially the hydrogeologic conceptual model, the nature and extent of contamination, and then identification of data gaps. Okay, Mike.
Okay, so just reiterating again that if you have any questions, we have a small enough group to where you can feel free to go ahead and interrupt. or click the raise your hand button, and Trilby will make me aware that there's a pending question, and we can deal with questions that way. So the objective really is to get you up to speed as to what to expect when you receive the draft RI report for review. You're not expected to, digest all the information all at once. This is like a preview of the information, but we welcome any interaction and feedback around it as well. So next slide, please. So first I'm going to talk about the textural model and hydraulic conductivity refinement work that we did around the City of Dinuba water service area. That's really where we focused. So next slide. Okay, so the process that we used for that was we started with retrieving the well completion reports and the drilling log files and putting them into a SQL database, and then determining which of those were of sufficient quality for us to use them for textural analysis. We looked at the USCS classifications and took the drillers' descriptions, and USGS had kind of like a key for different drillers' terminology as to what USCS classifications those would fit into, and then assign them either a fine or a coarse designation, with fine being silt and clay, and with coarse being sand and gravel. And then we calculated the lithologic thicknesses, and we aggregated them into 30-foot bins, and then assigned those 35% bins a percent coarse fraction. And then that percent coarse fraction for each 30-foot interval was used in 3D kriging using the SGEMS program. And so basically our procedure followed one that was developed by USGS and published by them, and we used a slightly refined aggregation interval from what they did. We initially used a finer aggregation interval and then landed on 30 feet as being optimal for our purposes. So this just shows again where the wells are located. We tried to focus our work on the area around the City of Dinuba water service area. And the intention there was to have a refined lithology in the area that is where we're actually modeling projects. And then that refined lithology gets integrated and grades into the CVHM or California or Central Valley Hydrologic Model lithology that was developed by USGS. So we're retaining the CVHM lithology outside of the area where we refined it using these wells. So this is just an overview of, we didn't take the kriging or refinement outside the area where we had wells. And then what we did was we incorporated a transition between this and the existing lithology in CVHM to provide a smooth transition. So this is just at one particular depth interval by way of example, the percentage coarse sediment. And what we generally saw is that toward the west and northwest, toward the Kings River, we tended to see more coarse grain sediments, a greater proportion of coarse grain sediments. And we did tend to see sort of a little bit of a north to south channelization, which, all of which is expected on this Kings River alluvial fan environment. So this provides a cross-section fence diagram going down to 230 feet that kind of shows the same thing and provides additional detail. And these are figures that will be provided in the report. And again, what you see is coarser grain materials toward the west. And we generally found that the upper 230 feet were a little bit coarser than down below. The 300, 400, 500 feet, we tended to have a little bit more fine grain material, but nothing that is as as drastic as the contrast that you might see, for example, with the Corcoran clay, which exists further to the southwest and just crosses the southwest corner of our green box. Oh, I love the horse. Let's go to the next slide. Okay, and then in order to attribute a hydraulic conductivity to our percent course, to develop the right algorithm and model for doing that, what we did was we took 50 some odd wells that we had either aquifer test or specific capacity test data for. And we only had aquifer test data just for a couple of shallower remediation wells in the center of the city. And the rest of the wells that we had here on the well completion records, we had specific capacity tests, which basically gave us, in order to assess the correct pump sizing and capacity of the well at the time of drilling, the drillers performed tests that gave, feet of drawdown per gallons per minute produced. And there are rules of thumb that are used that have been vetted out in the hydrogeologic industry for converting that into well transmissivity. And if you know the screen interval, you can calculate hydraulic conductivity. So we used that approach to calculate the hydraulic conductivity of the screen interval for these wells, and then use the correlation between that hydraulic conductivity and the percent course from our textural model for assigning the correct conversion factors to take our lithologic model and then use that to ascribe hydraulic conductivities in our groundwater flow model. And I may be simplifying that a little bit. Pete and Nick, you can feel free to jump in if I say anything that's wrong, and certainly you can be available to answer any questions. The blue wells inside the water service area, those are the city of Dinuba wells, and all of those we have a long history of specific capacity tests. So we have multiple specific capacity tests for those wells. The green wells, typically we only have one. Next slide. So another important consideration was the designation of groundwater zones as a construct for evaluating our data. Next slide. And specifically, what we wanted to understand was, how groundwater at different depths interacts with different kinds of wells. And in terms of contaminant distribution, can it be generally characterized as shallow and deep? And so we analyzed the data to figure out where does it make sense to put a divider between shallow and deep. We initially had hoped to identify a shallow, intermediate, and deep zones, similar to what's been done in Modesto, but we found that we didn't have sufficient data to really support contouring of contaminant concentrations in 3 zones. We did have enough data resolution to do it in 2. And what we ended up with from looking at various data was a depth of about 230 feet. Now that's significant because that's almost exactly what Ludorf and Scalmanini found for their nitrate management zone proposal and for the CV salts studies that were done in the area for determining a shallow and a deep zone related to vulnerability of wells to contamination. Most of the more vulnerable domestic wells are screened less than 230 feet deep. So what we found was additional information that was consistent with a construct that had already been established. So we can see that the screen elevations for wells and the hydraulic conductivity is correlated with depth. The shallow wells above 230 feet tended to have higher hydraulic conductivities than the deeper wells. So that's consistent with what I mentioned before, that below 230 feet, generally sediments were a little bit finer grained. Next slide. We also looked at the city well screens and found that in general in the city, the supply wells for the city were generally screened in what we were designating as the deep zone. A few of them, especially the irrigation wells, RCR wells 2 and 7, had tops of the screened intervals that extended up into the shallow zone. And those wells, with exception of the RCR well, had water quality issues. Next slide. So here you can see more detail regarding the screened intervals of the various wells. And, well 7, well 5, is that well 5? Yeah, those look like they were screened, entirely in the shallow zone. And then most of the current production wells, the higher numbers going up from 11 through 20 are screened primarily in the deeper zone. And then there's a few wells that are shallow and deep. You can see the wells with the dashed red lines, those have been abandoned. And, a bunch of those wells were abandoned because of water quality issues, and most of them were shallow. This gives you kind of an idea of how the wells are screened relative to this construct. It's not intended to be a cross section, it's just numerical from left to right. Next slide. And then this gives the sentinel monitoring wells in the city of Dinuba as a result of a settlement for some MTBE litigation. We had installed 4 clusters of 3 sentinel monitoring wells with 10-foot screen intervals. And the A zone and B zone wells were all screened in the shallow aquifer, and the C zone wells are all screened in the deep aquifer. So basically in the upper portion of our main production aquifer. Next slide. And then this shows that the contaminants also, the nitrate, dibromochloropropane, DBCP, and 1,2,3-trichloropropane, the TCP, also have trends that are related to shallow and deep. The nitrate, the highest concentrations are primarily in the shallow zone, but you can see that there's more variability in the deep zone. The DBCP, it's interesting that, well, let me back up, I read that wrong. There's more variability in nitrate concentrations in the shallow zone, and the average concentrations are higher. There's less variability in the deep zone, and the concentrations are lower. That's for nitrate. And that's a log scale on the left there. So for DBCP, we're actually finding that the concentrations in the shallow zone are lower than in the deep zone. And that's primarily because of DBCP in the upper portion of the deep zone between about 230 and maybe 400 or 350 feet. And that's consistent with the finding that DBCP was discontinued in California in 1977 and banned in the continental United States in 1979. And so this appears to support an interpretation that DBCP has been drawn deeper into the aquifer and that there's not as much loading taking place at the water table anymore. We'll take a closer look at that later. TCP, however, we're finding that the highest concentrations are in the shallow zone. And our finding there is that there's persistent sources of TCP still, winding their way through the vadose zone and getting loaded at the water table. And the deep zone appears to be cleaner. Next slide. So let's talk briefly about groundwater occurrence and flow. Next slide. So this is groundwater elevations in the spring of 2005, and we created maps for the shallow and for the deep zone. We see similar groundwater flow directions to the south and southwest across the city. 2015, the groundwater elevations were somewhat lower, but we see a similar general condition, groundwater flow direction. Next slide. And this just shows a hydrograph for the nested sentinel wells at one location for a location SW02. And what we see is that let's see, there's no key for A, B, and C. A and B track pretty closely, with B being slightly lower, and then C is the fine dotted line. That's always below the A and B. And so there's a downward gradient across the city, which you would expect because most of the pumping occurs from the deeper aquifers. And the general groundwater conditions around the city are semi-confined, so there are some impeding layers that allow semi-confined conditions and vertical gradients to develop. Not as pronounced, as I said, as closer to the center of the San Joaquin Valley Basin, where there's more extensive lacustrine clays, but we do get that semi-confining effect. Next slide. Oh, hang on. So one thing that I will note is that since the drought, that groundwater levels have declined and they've recovered somewhat, but not a whole lot. So with the drought being from about 2011 to about 2014, 2015, they kind of bottomed out there, 2015, 2016, and then leveled off and recovered slightly. So let's talk about contaminant sources and transport. I'm just going to go briefly into what we know here. I'm not going to read these off, but the primary sources for nitrate are agricultural fertilizers and concentrated animal feeding operations and municipal wastewater. Septic systems are also present around the region. And consistent with other studies, we're assuming for transport that nitrate does not undergo absorption or retardation. That's a very common assumption. You know, it's an anion, so it tends to travel with the water through the aquifer system at the same rate. And although, you know, there's evidence that, you know, in some areas or microenvironments that you might have chemical transformation and mineralization or denitrification occurring, generally in an oxic aquifer, once the nitrate is there, it's usually or often assumed that there's no chemical degradation or half-life that's implemented below the root zone. So most of the degradation, volatilization, mineralization occurs within the root zone. And what we did there was we simulated loading at the water table, and those values were derived using SWOT and then adjusted to achieve the observed shallow groundwater concentrations during the modeling process. Next slide. For DBCP, that was a very common, popular soil fumigant, and it was widely applied, especially to grapes and tomatoes. And in the Dinuba area, it was more grapes. There's a lot of grapes and raisins that are grown around Dinuba. Use started in the 1950s, and as I said, it was discontinued in California in 1977. And the current concentrations are decreasing, and that's consistent with observations throughout the San Joaquin Valley. There was lawsuits and settlements regarding DBCP, and most of the defendant payments for treatments are being discontinued because it's been found that slowly those concentrations have been decreasing. It is weakly sorbed to the soil. And actually has very similar absorption and transport processes or properties to 1,2,3-TCP. Biodegradation is generally thought to be insignificant below the root zone. So in an oxic aquifer, the half-life's been estimated at anywhere from 6.1 to about 141 years. There's been some other studies in the Fresno area that actually bring that half-life estimate down to about 4.4 years, but 6.1 is probably a good conservative number, and that's in the absence of significant biodegradation. So we're going to simulate loading at the water table to match the shallow groundwater concentrations, and then we're going to decrease the loading in accordance with the decrease in concentrations, this long-term decreasing trend that we observe at City Well 14, and I'll show you that in a moment. Next slide. TCP was an impurity or contained in soil fumigants. I say here applied mostly to annual crops. It was actually quite a bit on perennial crops as well. Further to the north, though, we found that the highest TCP concentrations are associated with sweet potatoes and cotton. But the two soil fumigants in which TCP was an impurity were also widely used on fruit crops, tree crops. Use started in the 1940s, and it went through various different reformulations and regulatory updates in terms of use and handling, and then it was eliminated in 1984. Just as a side note, it's been hypothesized that there may be longer-term sources for 1,2,3-TCP because the formulations in the up to the late 1950s had sort of a complex, larger hydrocarbon, oily, tarry residue that was left in the soil in which the TCP can survive for a longer period of time because it's actually isolated from the oxic and infiltrating water influence, chemical influence. And so it can persist for a long period of time. The MCL and the detection limits currently are extremely low. And so that presents some problems in terms of the data and gathering the data and being able to have data that you can interpret contours from. The transport characteristics are similar to DBCP. Fate characteristics are also similar to DBCP. It tends to be a little bit more resistant to degradation. And we've seen half-lives estimated anywhere from 44 to over 300 years in oxic aquifers with, close to neutral pHs. So similar to DBCP, we're going to simulate loading at the water table as a constant rate to match shallow detected concentrations, but we're not going to decrease that source over time. We're going to assume that it remains constant. So again, these are the wells that we use to contour contaminant data. And the wells outside of the Dinuba refined model area were used only to provide perspective on the contours inside the area. So our focus that we're going to show is inside the area, but we use data outside the area to augment what we had there. So let's go to nitrate first. Let's go to the flow chart of how we did this. So what we did was we took data from various different sources and we put it into our database. Next slide. So this is a little bit busy. It'll be in the RI report, but on the left is basically we took the data that we had for points for which we had data. So and we took the well data and tried to attribute the well data to certain depths. One of the difficulties with the GeoTracker data set is that for the majority of the wells, you actually may not know how deep they are. And pairing them with well completion records can be very difficult and time consuming. So we did not do that. So what we did was we looked at wells with reported screen intervals using a 90% threshold, meaning that if 90% of the screen interval was in the shallow zone, we attributed that to the shallow zone. If 90% was in the deep zone, we attributed it there. And if it was something different and it spanned both, we didn't use that data for contouring. We attributed wells with no screen interval, but total depth that was less than the shallow zone to the shallow zone, because it's the only place where there could be screened or deriving water. And we assumed that all domestic wells were shallow. And then with respect to the data, we focused on data between 2015 and 2021. To kind of broaden the number of data points, we figured that, okay, if we use an average of 2015 to 2021 data, we'll have more data points, we'll have a more robust analysis. And for wells with depth discrete profile samples, which were all wells for which we collected data, what we did was we actually used the profile concentrations and we averaged those to get average and maximum concentrations for each aquifer zone. And then for all other well samples, we calculated temporal averages and maximum concentrations for that 2015 to 2021 period. And then we had to deal with ND data. So ND data is still data. We didn't want to ignore it. But if a lot of the data had multiple reported detection limits, in which case what we used for, for contouring was we assumed that they were all at the lowest detection limit for averaging, and we disregarded any data points that had elevated detection limits resulting from sample dilution. So we used that lowest detection limit. And then DBCP and TCP, especially TCP because of its very low MCL and detection limit, turned out to be problematic. So it required a little bit of additional attention. So in some cases, the NDs were elevated. So we might have an analysis that was reported, for example, where we had a TCP concentration of 1 microgram per liter, or a detection limit of 1 microgram per liter, which is for TCP a very, very high concentration. And we didn't want to contour a high concentration because we had that kind of an artifact. So we disregarded all NDs if they were greater than or equal to the MCL. We did not want to identify an aquifer volume as being impacted above the MCL based on an elevated detection limit only. We wanted it to be based on actual detections. If they were less than the MCL, we included them. Then we merged the two in that triangle. And then lastly, next slide. We contoured shallow and deep aquifer nitrate using kriging. And then we contoured DBCP and TCP because of that. Because of the more limited availability of data points, it turned out using all of our analytical steps, data evaluation steps, we had a lot of nitrate data that was very robust. For DBCP and TCP, we had fewer data points, so we used an inverse distance weighted approach for contouring that, and that's well supported by the literature. Okay, now here's where I should have done a drum roll. So these are average nitrate concentrations. And so the interesting thing here is that, so way over on the west near the Kings River, we see low concentrations. That's to be expected. There's lots of interaction with the Kings River and recharge from the Kings River. And this is consistent with some reports that were done by Ransom and others that indicated that proximity to rivers and concentrated recharge sources is one of the biggest predictors of nitrate concentrations. The other thing, and this came as maybe somewhat of a surprise, is that around the wastewater treatment plant, it appears that since implementation of the RCR project, and the infiltration of water that has on average about 2 milligrams per liter nitrate, that we actually have a clean water mound in the shallow zone in that area. And it extends down gradient from there, and the amount of migration is equal to about 10 years of travel time, which is when the RCR project was implemented. These are average concentrations in the deep zone, and the thing that stands out immediately is, well, they're much lower. And then we see this orange area, we call it the orange rat to the west of the city. And what we believe happened there is there's a number of wells there that are completed in the upper portion of the deep zone that were drawing down the nitrate and DBCP and TCP impacted groundwater into the upper portion of the deep zone in that area. And then the groundwater mound below the wastewater treatment plant is probably moving some of the groundwater flow toward the west in that area as well. So this is DBCP. Now for each contaminant in the shallow and deep zone, we have maximum and we have average concentrations. There's no particular reason that I chose the maximum for DBCP here. They're actually very similar to the averages. I mean, they show the same patterns, but they just happen to be handy for this presentation. So basically what you see here is that with a couple of specific exceptions, DBCP tends to be relatively low compared to the MCL in the shallow zone. Next slide. And in the deeper zone, we see higher DBCP, and especially there north of the wastewater treatment plant area, there's some of these shallow wells that are completed between about 250 and 350 feet. One of them, I think, down to 400 feet. These are small water systems, and the DBCP tends to be a little bit higher there. And then the CW19 is an exception. Well 14 is an exception. Well 14 is interesting because it's located in a portion of the city that's still agriculturally used. And if you look at historical aerial photography from the 1970s back to the 1950s, it was primarily in grapes. And then lastly, TCP. And what I want you to notice here first is that, okay, the contours are a little more choppy. We have the least usable data for TCP, but we have enough to infer some contouring. And so the maximum concentrations in the shallow zone around the western part of town near the wastewater treatment plant tend to be fairly low. And then the other thing I'd like you to notice is that around the city it's low, but then it's higher up gradient, down gradient, side gradient from the city. You have higher TCP concentrations from historical soil fumigant use. The interpretation is maybe a little bit more tentative because we have fewer data points, but it does seem to show that pattern. And then well 14 again tends to, well 14 is not completed in the shallow zone, so you'll see it in the deep zone. So let's go to the next slide. There, to the east of the city, perhaps the extent of the green area there can be considered somewhat of an artifact, but that's how it contoured out. So again, beneath the city, you tend to see lower concentrations. The exception is well 14, and then on to the west side, to the west of the city, where the groundwater has been drawn down by these wells completed in the upper portion of the deep zone. So these just show some selected graphs. Nitrate concentrations in well 14, you can see, again, these are log scales. You can see that that's below the MCL. It's a deeper well. Family Tree Farms is completed. It's a small water system, non-community water system that's in the upper portion of the deep zone. And you can see that the nitrate evidently was being drawn down there. You can see the increasing and now stabilized near and above the MCL. And Peter's Fruit Farms, similar kind of thing, some more data variability. And by the way, the data variability on these wells often is related to not variability in the groundwater, but variability in how the wells are operated and sampled. You can see that for Peter's Fruit Farm that prior to, looks like 2016, the concentrations were pretty stable. And then after that time, there was a lot of variability. So, and I don't know if prior to 2016, if that's to the extent to which that's related to, perhaps, detection limits, but, Family Tree Farm, you can see a smoother curve then as well. And then, as the concentrations increased, there may have been more variability in how long the wells were operated prior to sampling, and other factors that can change the individual sample results. So this is DBCP. Well 14, I mentioned, was slowly decreasing. We have a long-term, you can fit a line to that. You can get yourself, a half-life or a decay for your source. Family Tree Farm seems to be pretty stable above the MCL, and Almonte Mobile Home Park is above the MCL and may be stable at this point, but it's definitely above the MCL. Next slide. And then TCP. Again, the data is a little bit more spotty. It looks like well 14 we're kind of stable at this point, but increased over the years since the early 2000s. Family Tree Farms stable, maybe slightly increasing. Peter's Fruit Farm, That line going up to the left is actually an artifact. That was one of those elevated detection limits, so that should probably be taken off. But maybe slightly decreasing to stable at Peter's Fruit Farms, but well above the MCL. So let's talk about the implications briefly for solute transport model development. Next slide. So what we did was we extracted what we call the Dinuba subregional model, or DSRM, from the USGS Central Valley hydrologic model. They're both in ModFlow. Central Valley hydrologic model is very often, there's subregional models that are extracted from it and then refined. So that's the approach that we took. We had to take that approach since we weren't able to get access to the AID model, which we had originally hoped. But the AID model was also extracted from the CVHM, so we wound up with a little bit of extra work. We wound up with a similar result. The DSRM has water budget boundary data available, the CVHM has data available up through 2003. We wanted to go a little bit more recent so that we could take advantage of data inside the city. So C2VSIM, which is a different model built by the Department of Water Resources, has detailed data available through 2015. So we decided to update the DSRM through 2015. And the purpose of the DSRM is solely to provide boundary conditions to our detailed model area, which is the Dinuba refined model. And so for that, we telescope down, we refined down from 1 mile grid cells down to, I believe it's 300-foot grid cells. We updated the local hydrology and pumping. We calibrated to heads, vertical gradients, and ambient well flows. And we used that updated textural model. And then lastly, we developed, and we're currently in the process of finishing this, developing the solute transport model. We used the contour data to set initial concentrations and loading rates. We had a warm-up period that we simulated to make sure the model is stable and the concentrations are stable. And we adjusted loading until we achieved stable concentrations close to current concentrations at the end of that warm-up period. And we started with nitrate, for which we have the most data to get the model running properly. And then we're in the process right now of adding DBCP and TCP initial conditions and loading rates and retardation. So this just shows an outline of the grid for the CVHM. The goldenrod rectangle is our DSRM, our sub-regional model. And then the inner area there, it almost looks like it's highlighted in yellow, but it's not, okay? If you look very, very closely, I don't know if you can tell at this resolution, there's actually a bunch of tiny little squares in there, and those are the 300-foot cells. So that gives you an idea of how much we refined the model discretization in that area. And the Kings River kind of runs along through the western part of the DSRM and just cuts through the westernmost corner of our DRM, or our Dinuba refined model. Next slide. So this just gives you an idea of the vertical discretization. In the final model, we actually took the upper couple of layers and we joined them. So there's maybe a thicker uppermost layer there that's not shown here. But the rest of them are as shown. So you can see that we added a lot of layering through the depths that the city wells are completed in. And the purpose of that was because vertical flow is very important in a municipal well field. We wanted to be able to simulate that effect. So this just shows again the process for our hydrologic model. We first built the DSRM. We assessed the calibration and refined it as needed. And then we updated the DRM area within the DSRM and ran them together to make sure that the calibration was still good, and we refined it as needed. And then we extracted that model. So we took the boundary conditions that were provided by the DSRM and extracted them. So now we're just running the DRM. And then with the DRM, we calibrated that to heads and water budgets, vertical gradients. You make sure that the vertical gradients are going in the right direction and have the right approximate magnitudes. To municipal well passive ambient flows, we wanted to compare those to make sure that we can simulate roughly the ambient flow that we're actually seeing. And then currently we're in the process of looking at the nitrate distribution to make sure that the overall, the general distribution we have right. And then we'll simulate project alternatives and report the results after 20 and 50 years. 20 years is an important milestone because that's the performance milestone for the grant program, but we wanted to provide the long-term perspective on 50 years as well. We think that's of interest. And we selected an annual hydrology to repeat. The 2015 water budget and pumping rates are actually maybe a little bit on the low side, but they're a reasonable hydrology to repeat in the long term in terms of groundwater pumping demands. And we'll take a no project base case, and then we're in the process of developing implementation project scenarios. I'll show those later. And then for each implementation project scenario, we're going to take the predicted concentrations and subtract them from the base case and create maps that show the changes in concentrations to assess those project scenario effects. So we're not going to absolutely predict concentrations, but we're going to use what's called a superposition approach to assess changes in concentrations. So this just shows some calibration results by layer for the DSRM. 45-degree line or one-to-one line going through the middle there would be a perfect alignment between observed and computed target values for groundwater levels. And what we see pretty much what you want to see, which is results that are kind of clustered around that line with fewer and fewer results as you move away from that line, but no bias above or below. So, our assessment is, and then we have some more detailed statistics we can provide, but our assessment is that this is a pretty well calibrated model for the level of detail that we're trying to achieve for our particular analysis. And then on the right, you see a nice bell curve distribution in terms of, how many occurrences do you have where your heads are either above or below. And what you want to see generally is a nice bell curve that's centered close to zero. So, it's a little bit to the right of zero, but that's pretty close. So that's, what you like to see for a model. If it's skewed to one side or the other, then you could argue that the model has some bias. Here's the same thing for the DRM. Similar result. It's a little bit to the right of zero. The bell curve is actually a little bit tighter. The calibration could be improved by spending more time on automated calibration, but we felt that for our purposes, this was good enough. If there's other purposes needed in the future, then that calibration could be further improved. But we're thinking this is a pretty good result. And then this is just showing you one quick snapshot of what the SWOT model outputs. For those of you that are familiar with it, we do quite a bit of SWOT modeling throughout the Central Valley, looking at groundwater protection values and groundwater protection targets. So that's a combination of an agronomic, hydrologic, and soil model. And it gives us loading. And in the middle of it, you see this green spot with low loading, and that's the city of Dinuba. And then there's various different agricultural fields and cropping patterns and soil patterns where you get higher loading rates in the surrounding area. So that's our starting point for simulating nitrate loading at the water table. And then we adjust it based on what we actually find in the groundwater. So just very quickly, we have developed model scenarios. Our scenario one is a project that's identified in the GSP. Which is a recharge basin or basins on the northeast side of Dinuba. And we have two different alternatives with that. One is one recharge basin, one is two recharge basins. We're going to simulate that. Scenario two is rebalancing pumping. We know that well 14 is impacted by DBCP and 123 TCP. It's already being treated using carbon What if we increase pumping from that to remove as much DBCP and TCP, and we decrease pumping from a couple of the other nearby wells, well 16 and well 20? So it's intended to assess that. Scenario 3 is adjusting the RCR well pumping. The RCR well is currently pumping low nitrate groundwater. The high nitrate groundwater has been removed from that area and replaced with low nitrate water recharged from the wastewater discharge ponds. And so what we would do is we would implement deeper pumping at RCR to capture that deeper nitrate, you know, the tail of that rat to the west of the city. Scenario 4 is shallow pumping of groundwater in nitrate impacted areas. We have various areas at the city where nitrate impacted water could be used for turf irrigation at athletic fields or new high school, and then, you know, adding fertilizer to those would be done very carefully at agronomic rates, monitored closely to make sure that we have low nitrate loading resulting, and that we pump out the nitrate contaminated groundwater and basically re-infiltrate it through our through these turf areas using a fertigation approach. Scenario 5, recharge and extraction. So there we would simulate recharge at some existing recharge basins near well 14, adding an additional basin near well 14, adding a basin in the RCR area, and at the same time coupling that with shallow groundwater extraction at the new high school located near well 14 and at the RCR well to see if we can achieve the same kind of flushing effect as the RCR project seems to have implemented. And we're very interested and focused on that particular project. You know, we think that probably our instinct is that probably shows the most promise and might be the preferred project, but we need to evaluate it on its own merits and compare it to the others. And then scenario 6 is Wellfield expansion, and that's shallow pumping on the west side of the city as the Wellfield is expanded. So currently, well 21 is proposed for installation west of the city. We are concerned about heading off a potential repeat of what happened with well 14. And so the scenario that would be simulated there would be shallow pumping in the zone where DBCP and TCP have been detected in the upper part of the deep zone at the mobile home park and the family tree farms, and then water service connection to those small water systems so that they stop pumping, we start pumping where we want to pump, and the city provides water to those small water systems. Next slide. So primarily data gaps and primary data gaps and opportunities. You know, as I mentioned, there's only limited DBCP and TCP data that could be reliably attributed to specific aquifer depths, and NDs were problematic, especially for TCP. What's the upshot of that? If you want to implement a Wellfield expansion program to the west of the city, you know, a detailed program where you don't yet have zone sampling, you need to collect zone sample data. Currently, for well 21, we have zone sampling, so we have those data that could be implemented, and we could assess the, you know, the merits of additional shallow pumping to prevent drawing contamination deeper into the aquifer. But for other future wells that might be located in that area, we don't have that information. And so, you know, before potential projects could be assessed for Wellfield expansion, that zone sampling and probably running updates to our groundwater model would be necessary. I mentioned model accuracy could be improved. And that's something that might be necessary in the future. It isn't necessary for our purposes at this point. And model accuracy could be improved as well. Same comment on that. And then site-specific infiltration rates are going to be needed for final recharge basin design. You know, we can use current data in terms of the city's observations about which basins perk well and which ones don't. and soil data from Sergo and from other sources, from some of the lithologic analysis, we can estimate those on a rough basis to see what the performance would be and develop conceptual designs. But as part of a detailed design process, one would want to go in there and do some infiltrometer testing to go from, say, 35% design to a 90% design. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Sarah.
Thank you, Mike. And thanks for having some coffee this morning. That was a good, fast presentation of a lot of slides. And then also, folks, if any of you saw a beautiful horse during our presentation, that was Trilby's horse. And thank you so much, Trilby. She needed to change out a slide that I had. So let's go to the next slide, which is now an updated version. And Robin, especially for you, I had submitted an earlier version that had the wrong dates on it. So here we go. The draft RI report we're going to put together and submit to you folks in about 2 weeks, August 16th. You'll have a month to review it, and we look forward to your comments. The groundwater modeling tech memo will be submitted in the first quarter, as in the next couple of months, and the draft FS as well. And then we submitted a request to extend the schedule from July 2021 to January 2022, and that is being reviewed by the Water Board, and it's pending approval upon receipt of the RI report. And then
Sarah, can you clarify? You say first quarter 2021, which obviously has already happened. Are you talking about first quarter of the current fiscal year? So we're talking about the third quarter, the third calendar quarter. Is that correct? Okay.
I went ahead and moved it over to the quarters, as in Robin's quarters, the Water Board.
Oh, got it. Okay.
Yeah, because I think it was confusing.
Yeah, it can be very confusing just because, our accounting department has different quarter system than we do. And so we kind of have to know both the accounting, which is the one that's displayed here, where the first quarter starts in July. And we use the calendar quarters as well, which is, as you know, I forgot the name of now. The quarterly
progress report.
Sorry, yeah. And so then that would be, the third quarter would start July, August, September. That's the third quarter, calendar quarter of the year.
Yeah, so now we're back on schedule so that this project will be completed by January 2022, as in closeout. So
that would be the work completion date, and then the final reimbursement request date would be a month after that.
I think the final completion report would be in December.
Okay, so you don't think that you're going to need any additional time in order to complete all the necessary deliverables? You think you'll be able to do it by this December?
That's right.
Okay.
and primarily because the grant program round 3, the concept proposal is due September 7th, 2021. And that means that all of our options will be evaluated by them and will be, buttoning up following that submittal of the concept proposal. And that means that the FS and all the other work should be completed, shortly after.
Okay. So you're kind of expecting all of this to sort of fall like dominoes. So as soon as you submit the draft RI report, then you'll have the tech memo, and then you'll have the FS report, closely following that.
That's right.
Okay.
Yeah. So that's it for me. I think the rest is just any questions. Next slide. I guess the next presentation would be to specifically outline the feasibility study options and the results of the transport modeling, and then the option analysis and the preferred alternative, and that we're again, because of the submittal of the concept proposal, we think we can get the next meeting in September 2021 with the idea that, again, we're presenting it in advance of you receiving the feasibility study report. Okay, any questions from anyone?
Well, I mean, for one, bravo on all of the data that you did in the presentation. Holy crap. So much data to compile. And the groundwater model is starting to look really good.
Yeah, we actually, I looked at some of the predicted nitrate concentrations, and they are looking really good. Our simulated nitrate concentrations look very similar to our actual contoured, creek distribution. So I think it's shaping up really nicely. It was worth the effort.
Well, then I guess following that, I guess from the state water board point of view, I just want to make absolutely certain that you're not going to need any extra time, because if we start processing the time extension request right now, and that's to move the data out from October to December, I believe, this would be, we would no longer have time to process another time extension request after this one. So this is going to be kind of the last one possible. So I just want to make absolutely sure that all your scheduling, all your ducks are in a row, and you don't think they're going to have any more delays.
Sarah, do you need me to weigh in regarding the waterfowl being in line? Waterfowl being in line, I think they are. So
yeah. Robin, I'm looking at the proposed extension right now, and November 30th is the projection for the final project report.
Yes, because we have to have that for the work completion date.
Yep. Yes, so we've got some work to do, August, September, October. Okay. Any questions from Tricia? Or Kristen?
No. It sounds like, very comprehensive effort, and you're very aware of timelines and what needs to be done. So sounds good to me.
Great. Kristen, any questions?
No questions from me. Nice work, though.
Thank you. All right, Trilby, you're welcome to wrap us up.
All right.
We might just ask Paul if he has any questions, or if he wants to talk about DBCP or TCP. We welcome your input and your expertise in those particular contaminants. If you want to have another conversation about it as well. So.
Yeah, I don't really have any questions at this time. I understand that there's limited data for the TCP. I'm going to go into Gamma and kind of look around at what there is for point source information, because that was really my only big question. But
yeah,
I'll wait to get the draft and take a look at it and stuff then.
So point source information, Western Farm and Reedley, I think may be a TCP source. It's certainly it's a nitrate source, and I need to double check. I think it may be a TCP source. Wouldn't surprise me anyways. They probably had the the DD stored there in tanks, because they did at other facilities. But in Dinuba, we actually didn't have any ag distributors or local storage sites. So, as near as I can make out, we didn't have any point sources of TCP in Dinuba. But if you find any, please let us know, because that may change our calculus.
Okay, yeah, I'll let you know. I have a site in Reedley that's sort of down to cross gradient from WFS, and we don't know where the TCP is coming from necessarily. It was a dry cleaning site, but we're seeing TCP at 20 micrograms per liter, 40 micrograms per liter.
Holy
so we're
cow.
still trying to figure that out. So
Okay.
there may be I know there are non-ag related sources for this stuff, but without doing a phase one or something like that of the entire city, it may be hard to pin down.
Right. Yeah, I mean, that, it was used as an industrial solvent in some cases. I mean, usually in the San Joaquin Valley, you think ag, but, we forget that other industries used it as well.
Yeah, but I do want to say it was a great presentation. I look forward to seeing the report you guys are going to put out.
Okay, well, thank you. So, I mean, I think that it sounds like we've achieved our objective of at least giving folks an overview and, kind of prepping you, maybe making your review a little bit easier. So that's definitely an objective. So.
Yeah, we're excited to see it.
Okay, Trilby, back to you.
All right, great. Any other comments or questions from the attendees? All right. Well, as Sarah said, the next meeting will be probably in September. So we will send out a doodle poll like we did for this meeting to compare schedules. So keep an eye out for that here shortly. And thank you all for attending. And we will be sending out a meeting summary and have the recording available as well. So at this meeting. So with that, thank you all, and we will see you at the next one.